2 weeks ago, I started working on the biggest helmet I've ever made so far, and now it's finally done. This is a 3D printed Royal Guard helmet from Star Wars, and I'm going to show you step by step how I turned this into this. I purchased the STL files for this helmet over on the Galactic Armory website. My favorite thing about this model is how these larger pieces can easily fit together in a way where it doesn't leave any messy seams for you to go back and fill later on. As for the scaling of the helmet, it's pretty forgiving. It fits a 24-inch head circumference, which is more than enough, so I went ahead and printed it at its default size. Because this helmet is so big, it does need to be cut up into multiple parts, that way it can fit on the build plates of my printers. Even if I had a printer big enough to print this thing in one shot, I don't think I would have, and I wouldn't recommend doing it either. My reason for that has to do with the sanding and post-processing phase, so I'll circle back to this and explain later on when we get there. I printed this helmet on my Creality K1 Max as well as my Bamboo Lab P1P. With all of that out of the way, let's get printing. Now that everything's printed, we are left with a bunch of plastic which we have to try and make sense of. Using the assembly animation as a reference, you'll see that the helmet is made up of 5 large pieces. Using a soldering iron, I welded all of the corresponding parts together until I was left with the 5 large parts. Now that I have those 5 main components, I wanted to make sure that the helmet would assemble properly and could also be worn. I applied some duct tape on the inside of the helmet to keep all of the pieces in place and everything assembled perfectly as it should. It's now time for the most tedious and time-consuming part of this build, the sanding and post-processing phase. And due to the size of this helmet, we've got our work cut out for us. It's important to mention again, I've decided to not permanently assemble the helmet just yet, and I'll explain why now. This helmet, when fully assembled, is unable to balance on its own and is very wobbly. It needs to be displayed on a stand or leant up against something, which is pretty risky. Our goal is to achieve the smoothest surface possible, which means a lot of sanding. Because the helmet cannot balance, if I were to sand it as one piece, I would risk the possibility of adding additional scratches and imperfections in the process, which to me seems counterproductive. It's far easier to sand the individual pieces and not make extra work for myself in the process. And because we know how easily all these parts fit together, it's no big deal. To kick things off, I started with my power sander and began sanding the helmet with 120 grit sandpaper, with my main focus being those welding lines where the smaller pieces were connected. Using an automotive glazing compound, I filled in those connection points and sanded them smooth, which took a few repetitions in order to get done. Now that those connection points are sanded smooth, it's time to move on to the next part, which is filling all of the layer lines on the helmet. To do this, I'm using an automotive high build primer by U-Pole, applying 3 coats with a spray gun. The reason I use a high build primer is because the product goes on super thick and does a really good job at filling layer lines. Another benefit is the product's low shrink rate. Filler primers shrink over time, which could potentially result in layer lines and imperfections reappearing in the future. Although this is the method I use, it does not have to be the method you use. Filling layer lines can be done with any method that works best for you. All it takes is a little elbow grease and joint pain. After the high build primer was applied, I sanded the entire helmet starting with 220 grit, working my way up to 600 grit. This part is just a seemingly endless process of sanding and spot filling with the same glazing compound shown earlier, as well as applying coats of duplicolor filler primer as I go. Now, I don't know exactly how much time I spent sanding, but eventually I hit a point where I just didn't want to do it anymore, and that's usually a good indication that you're close to being done. After an eon of sanding, we are almost ready to paint. The last thing we need to do is assemble the helmet for real this time. To do this, I used copious amounts of hot glue on the inside of the helmet. And just for some extra reinforcement, I did use my soldering iron to weld some of the seams on the inside as well. Now it's finally time to start painting. First, I primed the helmet using a Rust-Oleum flat white primer. For the base coat, I used a Krylon Gloss Red Pepper and applied 2 coats. And I gotta say, this paint is just beautiful. I used the same paint on my Miles Morales Spider-Man mask that I had made a few months back, so I'm glad that I got to use this paint again on another project. Now, as you can see, this paint is pretty glossy by itself, but I'm going to go ahead and clear coat it just to add that extra shine. The clear coat I'm using is a 2K polyurethane clear, which I also applied using a spray gun. The reason why I love this clear is that the atomization of the paint is so much better than a can of clear that you can get off the shelf. Using this 2K clear, you get a very high gloss with little to no orange peel. Now, you absolutely can use an off-the-shelf can of clear coat. What I've found though is that in order to get the level of clarity and gloss that the 2K clear has, you would need to wet sand, buff, and polish in order to reach that same quality. Another alternative would be a can of 2K clear coat. You can get amazing results with these as well. However, the major drawback is the cost. They're pretty expensive, around $20 per can, and they have a shelf life. So once you crack the seal on the bottom, you have to use the entire can within a certain amount of time or else it goes bad. If you want more information about this 2K clear that I'm using, please check out my previous video where I made a Stormtrooper helmet. I talk about this clear and why I decided to use it in more detail. After spraying 3 coats of clear, I gave the helmet a full 24 hours to dry before handling. While the helmet was drying, I went ahead and printed a display stand for the helmet. I'll include a link in the description where you can find and download it should you wish. Now that the helmet is painted and clear coated, the only thing left to do is install the visor. I used one of these tinted face shield visors that I purchased off Amazon for pretty cheap. One of the things included with the 3D files for this helmet is a printable template for the visor. After printing it, I traced the outline of it onto the visor, that way it can be cut out. Once cut, it's pretty simple installing the visor into the helmet. On the inside of the helmet, there is an indentation where the visor cutout can fit into place. Once it was installed, I secured it into place using hot glue. With the visor installed, this helmet is officially done. And I've gotta say, this looks absolutely beautiful. This helmet was a lot of fun to make. Since the surface is entirely smooth with no detail, as well as the fact that there's only one color to worry about, this helmet, while being the biggest, is by far one of the smoothest, stress-free projects I've worked on. I wanted to say a quick thank you to the Galactic Armory team for their work making this model, and thank you for watching if you're still here. I hope you learned something, I hope you enjoyed something, and I hope you come back next time for whatever project I take on next. Until then, take care, and I'll see you next time.